A scathing report looking into Prince Edward Island's only university revealed a toxic culture of sexual harassment and racism at the school. The report found that 29 people at the University of Prince Edward Island were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements over a 10-year span. Since the report came out, 2 members of the UPEI Board of Governors have resigned, including the chair. Premier Dennis King slammed the report's findings.
Oh, the report that came out is troublesome. It's worrisome. It's sickening to me, and I want people to know that that's the way I feel about it. I expressed that to the interim president and to the Board of Governors chair today.
The controversy has sparked a wider conversation, rethinking how non-disclosure agreements are used. Julie Macfarlane is the co-founder of Can't Buy My Silence, a group campaigning to ban non-disclosure agreements. She's also a professor of law emerita at the University of Windsor. Julie Macfarlane, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
What is your reaction to the findings of this report looking into what happened at the University of Prince Edward Island?
Well, 2 things. One of them surprised, and one of them not at all surprised. So let me start with the one that's not surprised, Dave, and that is that they uncovered, as we knew they would, multiple instances, in fact 29 is the figure given, of non-disclosure agreements being used to silence people who'd experienced misconduct at the university. And that was no surprise at all, because this practice is endemic, not only in UPEI, I'm afraid, but in universities across Canada and other parts of the world. But surprised that finally there was an investigation report that actually named, enumerated at 29, and called out the practice of non-disclosure agreements. Because, Dave, these are present in every investigation. If people aren't already NDA'd, they get NDA'd in order to participate in the investigation. But we've never seen anybody of the stature of Janice Rubin, who's done so much of this work, actually name them, because they're supposed to be secrets. Right. But this time she named them and enumerated them. It
was interesting in this case that the initial complaints against the former president, they used an NDA to sort of keep it quiet, but then were confronted with similar allegations 8 years later, which eventually led to this. So it's almost like the cloak of secrecy may have backfired on the institution in its attempts to keep it secret.
Well, I think it always does, Dave, because the point is that the perpetrators of misconduct tend to repeat the same behavior over and over again. And we've had decades of research that shows us this. Very small numbers of people responsible for almost all the misconduct. So they repeat. And if you hide what's happened, then they are able to repeat again. I mean, this is pretty obvious. You don't need a degree in law to understand this. If you cover it up, they are enabled to go on and repeat. And I think that Hockey Canada actually has been a really great example to bring home to Canadians, that if it's bad enough to cover up sexual assaults or sexual harassment or misconduct with non-disclosure agreements, that's bad enough. But you know what's even worse for your reputation these days? Being caught covering it up, which is exactly what happened to Hockey Canada and to UPEI, and is one of the reasons that we are campaigning to ban these abusive non-disclosure agreements in law.
What impact do these NDAs, obviously we've just talked about the reputational impacts, Hockey Canada, UPEI, but the individual impact of these non-disclosure agreements on the survivors of abuse and harassment and discrimination, what does it do to them?
Well, we know from our own data collection, Dave, that 95% of people who sign NDAs report that they have mental health consequences. And I think what you need to understand here is that very few people, and I've literally talked to hundreds and hundreds of people now, very few people understood what they were signing when they signed it. They just wanted to get out of there. Yeah. In their negotiation, they wanted it over. Their lawyer was urging them, just sign, just sign. So they read it when they kind of have the dust settled a little while later, maybe several months later. And that is when they realize that they have been gagged. And people feel a sense of constant surveillance when they're under an NDA. It's hard to explain this unless you know someone who's been through this or have been through it yourself, because we know that these clauses are probably a fraud anyway. Most likely, if they came to court, a court would not uphold them because they're unreasonable and too vague. But because people can't afford to challenge them, and because they're also afraid to challenge them, because even saying you've signed an NDA is technically a breach, this perpetuates this intimidation, and it means that people really do feel like Big Brother is watching them the whole time.
Yeah, you're afraid to say something, to run afoul of violating it and deal with further consequences after everything you've already been
and
through.
Paying back your compensation. Exactly.
Right. And some people may want to remain confidential, so this becomes a challenge too, right? So what kind of an alternative exists for a person who has been harassed in some form to maintain their confidentiality without having to sign something that also really kind of protects the perpetrator?
Yes, and I'm so glad you asked that question, Dave, because that is the critical question. And that is part of what our campaign is trying to make sure that the public understands. It's actually not that complicated. You can have a one-sided confidentiality agreement that protects the privacy of the victim or complainant. And personally, I think that that should be something that is always in place. But certainly, that is the way that you protect the victim without saying the only way you can protect your privacy is if we make it dependent on you protecting the other side. And that is a completely toxic, an unfair bargain, and an unnecessary one.
Prince Edward Island, the government has passed legislation limiting the use of non-disclosure agreements. It doesn't apply to this case because it can't go retroactive. What needs to be taken into consideration when legislating, passing laws on non-disclosure agreements?
Well, we have been pressing forward with legislation in Prince Edward Island, which has passed, and it's also this similar legislation is now tabled in Nova Scotia, Manitoba, British Columbia, and Ontario. And there's also a federal level bill as well, tabled by Senator Mary Lou McPhedran. And what is really important is that where NDAs are being used to cover up misconduct, not intellectual property, not trade secrets, not special research information or client confidential information. This was their original purpose, Dave, but it's just crept into everything now. So that people are even being asked to sign NDAs before they take a job. I call them the preemptive NDAs that say, if something bad happens to me, I'll never talk about it, even if it hasn't happened yet. So what the PEI legislation does is it makes clear that an NDA cannot function in that way. People have to understand them. They have to have opportunity to understand the alternatives, the one I've just pointed out to you. And much more important of all, most important of all, they cannot be made in a way that affects people's safety in the future. And if you allow a perpetrator who has already behaved badly to go on behaving badly because of the protection of an NDA, you are affecting public safety. Now, I'd love EI to release everybody from their past agreements because, of course, we work with people all the time who've already signed. That's the point. And they are the people who are really leading this movement. Legislation can't make something illegal if it happened in the past. It can only be legal or illegal according to what the law was at the time. But that doesn't mean that in the case of UPEI, and they have been asked to do this and have refused, they should nonetheless release everybody who has signed a non-disclosure agreement, all those 29 non-disclosure agreements, and we are also calling on corporations and universities to do the same elsewhere. They should simply voluntarily release them because you know what? When I ask people in upper management, whether that's in a university or in a corporation, would you actually enforce an NDA that you've put into a settlement agreement? They just laugh and say, ha, of course not. I mean, we'd look like really awful people if we did that. We get such bad publicity. So it's a fraud. It's a fraud on the public, and it needs to stop.
Julie Macfarlane, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. That's Julie Macfarlane, co-founder of Can't Buy My Silence.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you.